Hello, biology students. Today we're going to talk about the process of speciation. So today we're really getting into kind of the big idea of why evolution is such a big deal in biology. Evolution is a theory that explains not only why different organisms are different, but how all different types of species are related. And so today we're really going to start talking about how can we start with one type of species and end up with two or more different species that look and behave in very different ways. This process of creating new species is called speciation. And we're going to start today by watching a short video. There's a link in the note that'll pop up in just a second. This video is only 3 minutes long, but please watch this for a really good example of how this process can happen. So in that video, you saw how one population of salamanders over many generations could move and change so that by the end, they were two completely separate species. So if we think about how this works, here's my really rough map of California. Oh, crap, I need to redo this. So in that video, you saw an example of how one species of salamander could move over generations and change in different ways so that by the end, they were very, very different from each other. That's kind of how speciation works. So if I draw a really rough map of California there, it looks something like this, right? Our original population of salamanders lived up in Northern California, up in this region. Over generations, animals sometimes will move, right? A couple salamanders here wander a little bit this way, a couple salamanders here wander a little bit this way, and they slowly start to shift their range south. But as they mentioned, in the middle of California, it is really dry. There's this big kind of barren, dry valley, and salamanders don't do well where it's dry. And so they couldn't travel through the middle. So you ended up with some salamanders that moved along the coast and some that moved in the forest. And as they talked about in there, as they moved into these different environments, the selective pressures were a little bit different. They both were trying to escape predators, and so they needed to find ways to not get eaten because salamanders are pretty little. But because of the different random mutations that happened in those populations, the ones in the forest started to have some mutations and some coloration that came up that made them more camouflaged. So up along here, you started getting salamanders that blended in better and better with the forest. Whereas along the coast, there was a different set of mutations that happened, and those random mutations didn't necessarily help the salamanders blend in, but they made them look like poisonous newts. And so they started to mimic things that were poisonous, which made them look very, very different. And over time, they became more and more like that. And by the time they got to the southern end, they could potentially interbreed with each other again and come back together and be one group of salamanders, except they look so different that they may not even recognize each other as the same species. And if they do, if you cross a camouflage salamander and a mimicking salamander, you get something that doesn't camouflage well, doesn't mimic well. And so if the ones in between don't survive, then those two groups are probably going to stay separate and continue to evolve to become more and more different. This is one example of how new species can form. So what does it mean to say that something is a new species in the first place? At what point do we consider things different enough that we actually classify them as separate species? Well, that's a question biologists have been discussing for a long time. And here's kind of the general guidelines that scientists use. This one isn't really a hard and fast definition. There are exceptions to this. But in general, scientists consider organisms to be different species if they don't meet this definition. So organisms that are the same species can and will interbreed with each other. They can have offspring, and their offspring are fertile, which means their offspring can have more offspring. So you can continue passing on those genes. Here you see one example that kind of illustrates something that does not meet all the parts of this definition. So a horse and a donkey, if you breed those two together, you get this thing called a mule. So horses and donkeys can and do interbreed. They meet that first part. They can have offspring, but mules are not able to reproduce. Mules are sterile. They can't breed. They can't have more baby mules. The only place you get a mule is from a horse and a donkey. So they don't meet that third criteria. Their offspring are not fertile. And so because they don't meet that third part, that's why a horse and a donkey are considered separate species. So in order to become a new species, you have to get to a point where organisms either can't or won't interbreed, or if they do, they don't successfully have offspring, or their offspring are no longer fertile. So that's kind of where scientists draw that line and when we call something a new species. Here's the process of how speciation works. First, the original population, that original species, which we sometimes call the founder population, has to be separated into groups that either can't or won't breed with each other. That part is called reproductive isolation, and that's really important because to become a separate species, we have to separate the gene pools of those two groups of organisms. So they're no longer mixing DNA and mixing genes. So if a mutation shows up in one group, it's only going to stay within that group, and it won't also be spread to the other group. That's what eventually leads to new traits. So they have to be reproductively isolated. This can happen in a lot of different ways. It can happen through a physical separation, like the salamanders that couldn't cross the desert. That's a physical separation. That's a way they can be physically, reproductively isolated from each other. It can also be a behavioral separation. And we'll look at some examples of this over the next couple days. But if birds sing different songs, if organisms have different mating rituals or they're different colors and they just won't breed with each other, that does the same thing. It reproductively isolates them. Then once those groups are separate, natural selection that happens in one group will be different than natural selection that happens in the other, because each of those groups will have different random mutations that show up, and they may experience different selective pressures if they're in different environments, like the salamanders did. Those mutations and adaptations can sometimes change the ability and the willingness of organisms to interbreed. And so if the organisms change so much over the course of time that they either cannot or will not interbreed, or their offspring are no longer fertile, that's when we consider them separate species. So the salamanders aren't quite separate species yet. They still can interbreed in the south, and their offspring are fertile, but since their offspring aren't well adapted, they're probably not going to survive. And so those two groups will probably become more and more isolated, and they soon will become new species, even though they're not quite there yet. Here are a couple of examples. This example is similar to what we talked about with the salamanders. Once long ago, before there was a Grand Canyon in the Southwest, there was only one species of ground squirrel, these little chipmunk-looking things that lived in this area. But over time, as this canyon got deeper and deeper over millions of years, you can imagine if you are a squirrel living on one rim of the canyon, it's real hard to get to the other side. And so these groups of squirrels on one side of the canyon and the other became reproductively isolated. They didn't interbreed with each other anymore. They only bred with squirrels on the same side of the canyon as them. And once they were reproductively isolated, the mutations that appeared in their populations were different, and the selective pressures were different. So over time, they became two similar but distinct species. The one on the south side is called Harris's antelope squirrel, and the one on the north side is called a white-tailed antelope squirrel. They may still look really similar to us, but they can no longer interbreed and successfully produce offspring, and so they're considered separate species. So that's an example of a physical way that these were reproductively isolated. Here's an example of behavioral isolation. So this picture in the top left are little flies called maggot flies. Originally, these fed on hawthorn trees, which is this picture on the top right. You can see they look a lot like apples, but hawthorns were native to North America. They've always grown here. But then around 200 years ago, some settlers who were coming to North America brought in this middle picture, these things called apple trees. And some of those maggot flies flew over and said, hey, these taste pretty good too. And so some of them started feeding on apples. But the thing is, these flies are pretty small. They don't travel very far. Whichever tree they're born in, they tend to feed off that fruit and breed with other flies who are feeding off of that fruit. There's no reason they couldn't just fly to the tree next door and breed with a different fly, but they generally don't. And so because of that, because they tend to stay in the tree where they're born, that is a type of behavioral reproductive isolation. They are still becoming separated, and they start to evolve separate traits. Hawthorns and apples ripen at slightly different times of the year, and so the flies are starting to hatch at different times of the year when they're most likely to get the most fruit and have the most food. And so as they become more and more different and evolve those separate traits, eventually when they get to the point that they can't interbreed, they will be considered separate species. We're going to continue talking about this process and looking at more examples over the next couple days. But for today, you have a Google form that is homework. Please go into Classroom and work on that homework assignment and contact your teacher if you have any questions. Thanks and have a great day.